hungry, and est to hungry to form the comparative and superlative degrees, and the word would sound just fine. A hungry man, this man is hungrier than that man, this man is the hungriest of all. I think that sounds fine. So here we have a two-syllable adjective where the comparative and superlative degrees can be formed by adding er and est to the same word. On the other hand, take an adjective like gorgeous, a gorgeous day. How would you form the comparative and superlative degrees of that? Well, you could add er and est, but I think the result sounds a little awkward and is even a little difficult to pronounce. A gorgeous day, tomorrow will be even gorgeouser, and next week should be the gorgeousest of all. It's very hard to say that because of all the S sounds. And so the correct way to modify gorgeous and come up with the comparative and superlative degrees would be to add the extra word. Gorgeous, more gorgeous, most gorgeous. You can try this exercise with other two-syllable adjectives and adverbs. Easy, for example, would probably be translated into the comparative and superlative degrees by adding er and est. Easy, easier, easiest. Quickly, on the other hand, sounds less awkward if you use more and most. Quickly, more quickly, most quickly. When you're dealing with a two-syllable adjective or adverb, then, use your judgment, try reading aloud the phrase, and you can either use er, est, or more and most in forming the comparative and superlative forms. When in doubt, use more and most. Use the additional word, because that's never incorrect, and it will often be a little less awkward than adding er or est onto the positive degree of the adjective or adverb. Now, just to complicate your lives a little more, it's also true that in English, a few adjectives and adverbs have irregular comparative and superlative forms. That is, the comparative and superlative degrees are created not following any of the rules we've given so far. And you simply have to memorize the proper comparative and superlative degrees of these particular words. Here are the ones you need to know. Good is the positive form of the adjective. The comparative is better. The superlative is best. Bad is the positive form of the adjective. Worse is comparative. Worst is superlative. Many is the positive form of the adjective. More is the comparative. Most is the superlative. Much is the positive form of the adjective. More is comparative. Most is superlative. Well is the positive form of the adverb. Better is comparative. Best is superlative. Badly is the positive form of the adverb. Worse is comparative. Worst is superlative. In this lesson, we focused on the rules for creating the comparative and superlative degrees of adjectives and adverbs. Using these forms correctly can also be tricky in its own right, and we'll focus on some of the problems that arise in the next lesson. But first, turn to your study guide and try your hand at the exercise we provided to test the rules you've just learned. When you've finished, come back to this program, and we'll look at the exercise together. Now, in this exercise, we've provided a number of sentences, each of which has a blank space. And in the blank, a comparative or superlative adjective or adverb is required. We've provided at the end of the sentence, in parentheses, the positive form of the adjective or adverb. So your job is twofold. First, to decide whether the comparative or superlative degree is correct, and then to form it correctly and insert it into the blank space in the sentence. Let's see how well you did. First example. Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris began painting around the same time, but Picasso continued painting blank, then Gris. And the positive form of the adverb that we want appears at the end, long. So the first question is, do we want the comparative or superlative form of the adverb? And as you know, the distinction between comparative and superlative is based on whether we're comparing two things or more than two. Well, in this sentence, it's clear only two things are being compared, Picasso and Juan Gris. And therefore, the comparative form of the adverb would be correct, rather than the superlative. And how do you form the comparative form of the adverb long? Well, it's a one-syllable adverb, and therefore, you simply add the letters er at the end to turn it into longer. And the sentence would read, Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris began painting around the same time, but Picasso continued painting longer than Gris. Next example. Of all the sopranos in the choir, Lisette sings blank. And the positive degree of the word is well. Now, in this case, do we want a comparative or superlative form of the adverb well? Once again, it's based on how many things or people are being compared. And in this case, it seems clear that more than two people are being compared. The sentence reads, of all the sopranos in the choir. And in a normal choir, you would certainly have more than two sopranos. If there were only two, the sentence would probably read differently. It might say something like, of the two sopranos in the choir, or compared to the other soprano in the choir, something that would make it clear there's only two people involved. So the sentence certainly makes it sound as though there are three or more sopranos involved. So therefore, we want the superlative degree of the adverb well. And as you know, the adverb well is one of the irregular adverbs. It forms its comparative and superlative degrees irregularly rather than according to the usual rules. And the three forms of the adverb well are well, better, best. The superlative form is best, and the sentence should read, of all the sopranos in the choir, Lisette sings best. Next question. Although Nadia and Katya are both expert programmers, Katya is considered blank than her colleague. And the adjective that we want is talented. Okay, how many people are being compared here? Just two, Nadia and Katya. So we want the comparative form of the adjective. Now, how do we form the comparative form of the adjective talented? Here we're dealing with a three-syllable word, talented. You can hear that there are three separate sounds in that adjective. So to form the comparative degree, rather than adding er at the end, we'll add the word more in front of the adjective. So the sentence correctly should read, although Nadia and Katya are both expert programmers, Katya is considered more talented than her colleague. Next sentence. The island of St. Martin boasts 36 beaches, and many visitors say that Orient Beach is the blank of them all. And the positive degree of the adjective is alluring. First, how many things are we comparing? Well, obviously more than two. In fact, the sentence tells us there are 36 beaches involved. So rather than the comparative degree, we want the superlative degree. Now, the adjective alluring contains how many syllables? Three, alluring. Therefore, we need to form the superlative degree by adding the word most in front. And the sentence should read, the island of St. Martin boasts 36 beaches, and many visitors say that Orient Beach is the most alluring of them all. Next sentence. No one feels blank about the mistake Carlos made than Carlos himself. And the positive degree of the adjective is bad. Now, do we want the comparative or superlative degree here? This is a little tricky. You might be tempted to say, we want the superlative degree because we're comparing Carlos to all the people in the world. Of all the people in the world, who feels the most bad? It's Carlos. So therefore, superlative degree is involved. But once again, this is the kind of sentence which, although in terms of its meaning, it may seem to be comparing Carlos to all the people in the world, grammatically and logically, only two people are really being compared. That is, Carlos and no one. No one feels a certain way about it, and Carlos feels even more bad. I'm fudging in order to avoid giving away the answer. But you see, we're comparing Carlos with no one, so that grammatically and logically, we're just comparing two people or two things. That's why the comparative degree is used in a sentence like this, as opposed to the superlative degree, even though in a sense it appears we're comparing more than two people. We're using the comparative degree of the adjective bad, and remember, bad is another one of those words that forms its comparative and superlative degree in an unusual or non-standard way. The correct comparative degree of bad is worse. So the sentence should read, "No one feels worse about the mistake Carlos made than Carlos himself." Did you get all 5 of these questions right? Very good. Let's move on to our next lesson. Now, there are certain mistakes that people often make when using comparisons in sentences. In this lesson, we'll look at the 3 most common such mistakes and learn how to avoid them. First, avoid making a double comparison. A double comparison, what does that mean? Well, look at this example and then we'll discuss it. After dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of more livelier melodies. Maybe you can hear that something has gone a little wrong with the comparison here. What exactly went wrong? Well, remember that there are 2 different ways of forming the comparative and superlative degrees. You can either add ER or EST at the end of the word, or put more and most at the beginning of the word. And generally, you choose between these 2 methods based on the length of the word. If the word is short, you would add ER or EST. If the word is long, you would use more and most. And with 2-syllable words, you could go either way depending on how the word sounds to you. Well, occasionally people get a little confused and end up using both methods. That is, they use ER and EST at the end of the word and also stick more and most in front of the word. And that's what the author of this sentence has done. Rather than choosing between the 2 methods for creating the comparative degree of the adjective lively, the author has simply chosen to use both methods, and that has created what we call a double comparison. After dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of more livelier melodies. Now, what would be the correct way to write this sentence? Really, the author has 2 choices. Remember that when you have a 2-syllable adjective, lively, you have a choice of whether to use ER at the end of the word or more at the beginning of the word, depending on which sounds better to you. So the author could have written the sentence in either of 2 ways. The author could write, after dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of more lively melodies. Or the author could write, after dinner, the orchestra began playing a series of livelier melodies. Either one is really correct. It's just a matter of personal preference. The only thing that's wrong is to use both methods and create a double comparison. Here's the second common type of mistake. Some adjectives are absolute and cannot be compared. This means that there are certain qualities that are considered to either exist or not exist, and therefore it's not considered appropriate or logical to deal with comparative or superlative degrees. Either you are or you aren't, and you can't be more or less. For example, some of the adjectives that are considered absolute are first, last, equal, and unique. Perhaps you can see why these would be considered absolute qualities, which can't really be compared. For example, first. If you are first in line, you're first in line. No one else could be more first than you, or the most first. Either you're first or you're not. Perhaps the adjective where we see this mistake most often made is the word unique. Literally, the word unique means one of a kind. If something or someone is unique, that means there's no one else, nothing else like them in the world. They are simply different from everything or anybody else. And any one thing that is unique would be just as unique as anything else. In a sense, of course, all people are unique, but you can't really compare different degrees of uniqueness. If there's only one in the world, then there's only one in the world, and something else can't be more unique or less unique than that. Either something is unique or it isn't. If it isn't unique, that means there's another match to it. If it is unique, it's one of a kind, and it's an absolute quality. Nonetheless, people often mistakenly use the comparative or superlative form of the adjective unique, thinking, I think, that the word unique really means something like unusual. So you might often see a sentence like this one. The architectural designs of Frank Gehry are the most unique in the world today. This is really wrong because it is creating the superlative degree of the adjective unique, which should be considered absolute and therefore not comparable. You could make this sentence correct by changing the word unique to a word like unusual or distinctive. So the sentence would be correct if it read, "The architectural designs of Frank Gehry are the most unusual in the world today." You can see that this makes sense because there could be degrees of something being unusual. You could have one architect whose work is unusual, someone else who's even more unusual, and another person who's even more unusual than that. So unusual is different from unique, and it can be compared. Our third rule: make sure that the items being compared are truly comparable. If not, reword as necessary. Now, there are a few ways that you can go wrong in terms of drawing comparisons between things. And probably the simplest way to explain this is by showing some examples and discussing them. You'll probably recognize some of these mistakes because they're very common. We all make them in our writing. And whenever you make a comparison, you need to think carefully about what you're comparing and how in order to avoid these mistakes. Here's our first example. The tropical fish found in the Caribbean are less colorful and varied than the South Pacific. All right, the person who's writing this sentence is trying to compare two things, namely the tropical fish in the Caribbean and the tropical fish in the South Pacific. But notice the way the sentence is actually worded seems to be comparing things that can't directly be compared, because he's left out certain words. If you look closely at what the sentence actually says, it appears to be comparing the tropical fish found in the Caribbean with the South Pacific. The South Pacific, of course, being an ocean. So rather than comparing one group of fish with another group of fish, the author of this sentence, if you take it literally, seems to be comparing a group of fish with an ocean, two things that are not the same at all. Now, of course, we can figure out what the author means, so we don't literally become very confused by this. But again, there's that momentary hesitation. We have a vague feeling something's wrong here. The author's not saying exactly what he's really trying to say, and it is considered incorrect. So the author of this sentence would want to rewrite it in one of a couple of ways. One way would simply be to add in the words to make it clear what's being compared. So, for example, the sentence would be correct if it read, "The tropical fish found in the Caribbean are less colorful and varied than the fish found in the South Pacific." Now, it's clear that he's comparing two groups of fish. If you don't want to repeat the word fish, you can use a pronoun instead. And the sentence could then read, "The tropical fish found in the Caribbean are less colorful and varied than those in the South Pacific." Now the pronoun those has been used so that the word fish doesn't have to be repeated. And that would also be a perfectly correct way of correcting the error. The problem with the original sentence is that it seems to compare fish with ocean, and that, of course, doesn't logically make sense. And it's one of the types of errors of comparability that you need to watch out for. Here's another subtle problem that perhaps creeps into your own writing. "Our new customer service center will make your next visit to the store the easiest of all your past shopping experiences." Did you catch the error there, or do you have a vague sense as to what might be wrong? What are the things that are being compared in this sentence? Well, the person who wrote this sentence is trying to compare your next visit to the store with all your past shopping experiences. Well, that's fine, but notice that the way it's written, it makes it sound as though your next visit to the store is one of your past shopping experiences, because the sentence says your next visit to the store will be the easiest of all your past shopping experiences. The way the sentence is worded, it makes it sound as though your next visit is part of the group of your past shopping experiences. And of course, that doesn't make sense. Your next visit can't also be a past experience. I think what the author is doing here is jumbling up a couple of different ideas, and that's why he has ended up writing a sentence that isn't really very logical. Here's a good way to correct this sentence. "Our new customer service center will make your next visit to the store easier than all your past shopping experiences." By rewriting the sentence this way, the author is now making a clear comparison between your next visit and all your past shopping experiences. Rather than making the next visit sound like one of the past visits, he's simply saying the next visit will be easier than all those past ones. That, I think, is what the author was really trying to say, and just became a little confused in setting up the comparison. It's another example of the way it's easy to get a little tricked up when trying to make a logical comparison. Reread your comparisons and make sure that you've successfully compared the things you're trying to compare. One last example. Many historians consider Lincoln greater than any American president. Here we have another problem relating an individual to a group. What is the author of this sentence trying to compare? He's trying to compare Abraham Lincoln with all the other American presidents. But you notice what I just said, comparing Lincoln with all the other American presidents. After all, Lincoln, we know, was an American president. When we read this sentence, it actually sounds as though Lincoln was not an American president. Many historians consider Lincoln greater than any American president. Think about the group that's implied there. Any American president, that group would include Abraham Lincoln. If we take literally what the sentence says as it's now written, it sounds as though it's saying that historians consider Lincoln greater than all the presidents, including Lincoln. In other words, Lincoln is greater than himself. And obviously that's not logical or possible, nor is it what the author is trying to say. When you're comparing an individual to the other members of the group of which he's a member, you have to use the word other. So this sentence would be correct if it read, many historians consider Lincoln greater than any other American president. For the sake of logic, you need to use that word other when you're comparing a member of a group to all the other members of the group. As you can see, there's some subtle ways to get tripped up when you're trying to create a comparison. So read your sentences that contain comparisons carefully and make sure you haven't committed any of these basic errors. Okay, try your hand one more time at the exercise in the study guide, and then let's look at those questions together and see how well you've figured out how to avoid these problems with comparisons. Now, in these sentences, there's a comparison in each one, and only one is completely correct. The others all have an error of one kind or another, and your job is to locate the error and then figure out how to correct it. Let's see if you were able to do that. Start with the first example. The story of the development of anesthesia is stranger than any other scientific discovery. Here we have a subtle problem of comparing two things that aren't really comparable. Why is that? Well, let's see. What are the two things that are being compared in this sentence? First, we have the story of the development of anesthesia, and that is being compared to any other scientific discovery. Do you see what's wrong with this comparison? On the one hand, we have a story, and on the other hand, we have a scientific discovery. What's missing from the second part of the comparison is the idea of a story. What we're really trying to say, what the author is trying to say, is that one story is stranger than any other story. But the word story is necessary, otherwise you seem to be comparing the story with the discovery, and those are really two slightly different things. So the right way to state this same concept would be to say something like the following. The story of the development of anesthesia is stranger than the story of any other scientific discovery. Or if you don't want to repeat the word story, you can replace it with a pronoun and write the sentence this way. The story of the development of anesthesia is stranger than that of any other scientific discovery. Either way would be perfectly correct. The point is that you need to make the comparison between two comparable things, the story and other stories, as opposed to the story and the discovery, which are two incomparable, different things. Our next example is the sentence that happens to be perfectly correct. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg has the world's most impressive collection of paintings by Rembrandt. Here the Hermitage collection is being compared with all the other Rembrandt collections in the world. There are more than two, and so therefore the superlative form of the adjective impressive is correct, and there's no problem with comparability, there's no double comparison, and no adjective that is absolute has been mistakenly compared. So this sentence doesn't contain any errors. It's perfectly correct as written. Our next sentence does contain an error. The government of Switzerland is older than any government in Europe. Here we have a problem because Switzerland is, after all, a government in Europe, or Switzerland is a country in Europe. By saying that the government of Switzerland is older than any government in Europe, it seems to be saying, if you take it literally, that the government of Switzerland is older than any government in Europe, including that of Switzerland, since Switzerland is one of those governments in Europe. Once again, remember that when you're comparing one member of a group with all the other members of the group, you have to use the word other. So this sentence would be correct if it read, the government of Switzerland is older than any other government in Europe. Next example. Both Sheryl Crow and Bjork are gifted songwriters, but the music of Bjork is more unique than that of Sheryl Crow. Well, we're comparing two things, and so therefore the comparative form of the adjective is correct. But there is a problem because we're trying to compare the adjective unique, which, as we've seen, is an absolute. Either something is unique or it isn't. There's really no such thing as more unique or less unique. I think the author of this sentence is probably trying to say something else about the music of Bjork, and therefore the sentence could be corrected by changing unique to some other adjective which is comparable. So, for example, the sentence would be perfectly correct if it were written like this. Both Sheryl Crow and Bjork are gifted songwriters, but the music of Bjork is more distinctive than that of Sheryl Crow. So that would be one way of correcting the sentence. You could use other adjectives instead, such as unusual, but unique can't be used in this comparative or superlative form. Next example. Generations of travelers have described the waters of the Dead Sea as the most saltiest on earth. Our problem here is the problem of the double comparison. Remember that when you have a two-syllable adjective, you have two different ways of forming the comparative and superlative forms. Now, here we are dealing with a two-syllable adjective, salty. So we could create the superlative form by using most salty or saltiest. Either one would be correct. Unfortunately, the author of this sentence has chosen to use both, and that's a problem. That's considered grammatically wrong to use the double comparison, to use both forms of the superlative degree. So the sentence could be corrected in either of two ways. Generations of travelers have described the waters of the Dead Sea as the most salty on earth, or generations of travelers have described the waters of the Dead Sea as the saltiest on earth. This concludes our program on how to use modifiers correctly. Now you're an expert in using adjectives and adverbs and in creating interesting comparisons. So you should be able to go out and sprinkle your writing with all kinds of lively, vivid, colorful, and interesting descriptions using these modifiers correctly. And you can do it without fear of making a grammatical error. Thanks for watching, and I'll look forward to speaking